Troubles plagued Rome from the very birth of its republic. A while back I told the story of Rome's very first dictator, Titus Latius, who was granted unprecedented military and political power to stave off Rome's destruction at the hands of the Latin League. This story begins where that one left off, and believe me when I say that this story is one of the most important threads woven into the fabric of Rome itself, which would be tugged and pulled at for centuries to come. We are at the turn of the century here, leaving the 6th and entering the 5th BCE, and while art in Greece begins to flourish, the Italian peninsula is still a fragmented and dangerous place. Rome is on the rise, but it's not there yet, and the Latins are still their enemies. The Republic not only has to contend with warring tribes like the Sabines and the Volsci, but the machinations of the last Roman king, Tarquinius Superbus, who had Hang on a second, this just in. Apparently, it's not this type of war we're going to talk about here, but an altogether different kind of one. You see, wars, the swords and spears kind, aren't free, right? And back then, the drain on the young Republic's resources from all this fighting dragged them into a new war, one which existed before and still exists now. We can see it raging in the last decade.
And now, with his huge wealth, he is coming here to Washington to lecture the American people on how we have got to cut Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid for tens of millions of Americans who are struggling now to keep their heads above water.
And we can see it in the last century. The century before that.
Even worthless, unworthy you ought to be treated equally before the law.
And going just as strong the millennium before even that. I speak, of course, of class war. The struggles between the ruling rich and the oppressed poor, those with power and those without. The conflict of the orders. This is the name given to the class warfare which rocked Rome during the early Republic between the plebeian class and the patrician class. That's not to say there wasn't oppression of the common people from the Middle Republic right throughout the empire's history, but it's the conflict of the orders we're focusing on today. It was an essential chapter in Rome's evolution, not to mention a fascinating one. Our story begins with Rome planning another campaign against the Volsci tribe. Sed et bellum volscum minebat, et civitas secum ipsa discors intestine, inter patres plebemque flagrabat odio, maxime propter nexos ob aes alienum. But in addition to an imminent Volscian war, Roman society had its own struggles between the patricians and the blazing hatred of the plebeians, largely due to the debts which bound them in servitude to their creditors. They were the people who populated the army, fought for Rome's survival. Their reward? Not a lot at all. The rich were sucking them dry to keep fueling the very wars in which the poor were dying. Their cries for change kept growing louder, but nothing substantial happened until 495 BCE, when a filthy, emaciated man rushed into the forum, half mad with long hair, savage eyes, and scars across his skin. But what really shocked the Romans was that they recognized him. He'd been a successful officer, a commander of men. And when he'd returned to his farm in the country, the Latins had burnt it down, stolen all of his belongings. So what did Rome do for him for his service? They raised more taxes, and when he couldn't pay them, let alone with interest, the rich owner of his debt took the rest of his belongings and land too. But they weren't finished with him either. They then jailed him, tortured him, and left him to rot. That was it. The rage of the oppressed fanned into flame, and they unleashed themselves on the senators and patricians, screaming for change. The consuls, Appius Claudius, a name you should remember, and Publius Servilius, disagreed on how to deal with the rioting. The former argued for imprisoning the lot, the latter to agree to their demands. But before they could debate the matter further, scouts announced that a Volsci army was marching on Rome. Servilius acted quickly. He promised that he wished to improve their situation, but for now, Rome must come first. He said that it would be illegal to bind any soldier on active duty to servitude for their debts, and illegal to imprison or torture them. Encouraged by his words, the indebted plebeians rushed to enlist themselves to face the oncoming force. Their desperation rallied them, and the Volsci were eventually defeated, sent back from the walls over the next few days. But when they went back to the Senate, pleading with Servilius to keep his promise that their lot would improve, he was unable to help them. Appius Claudius and the patricians would simply not allow their debts to go unpaid. This is really when the conflict of the orders begins in truth. The poor had made their case, they'd been promised relief, and they were roundly betrayed. And therefore the plight of the plebeians continued, and the way in which they were used and abused, if anything, got worse. Debts were reinstated, and Appius Claudius put the full weight of his consular power to ensure anyone unable to pay their debt would be punished even more harshly. Another crack split down Roman society at this turn of events. Gangs emerged to prey on the rich, and violence roamed the streets. When 2 new consuls were elected the next year, the wealthy class of Rome still wanted a strong man like Appius Claudius in power to deal with it by force. Fortunately, the Senate realized that with the Latins still threatening them, a middle ground should be reached, and compromised with the appointment of a more moderate dictator. The dictator was Manius Valerius Maximus. The Valeria family was one of the most illustrious in Rome, which traced its roots to the time of Romulus, and was still present in the latest days of the empire. It boasted many emperors, including Diocletian and Constantine, to name just 2. They also earned a reputation for supporting the plebeians. And for his popularity, the plebeians continued to fight under his banner, and Rome launched a full 10 legions, nearly 50,000 men in all, to face the Latin tribes. It was a stunning victory, but when Valerius returned to the Senate and asked them to sort out the debt crisis, they refused. He resigned in anger, and although he'd been unable to help, the people applauded him. This might just have saved the current consuls' lives. Meanwhile, the Sabines, Strateanexain, Misona, Pareskefazonto were preparing to lead an even greater force against Rome with their allies. So they kept the army ready for war. The plebeians were again on the brink. They plotted at night to assassinate the consuls, anything that might free them from their cycle of oppression. But a particularly charismatic plebeian named Lucius Sicinius Velutus convinced them to go on strike instead. They were the farmers, and more importantly, the soldiers. So still in their military regalia, they marched out from the city and set up camp 3 miles away on top of Mons Sacer, the sacred mount. This was called the secessio plebis, the secession of the plebs. They set up fortifications there, swore never to assist the patricians, and to support each other in all and every plight. Whenever the patricians sent lictors or remaining soldiers up there, either to arrest someone or beat them into submission, they were fought off en masse by the people. The Senate quickly realized that without farmers or soldiers, they were totally vulnerable to the Latins at the gate, and needed to resolve this quickly. The former dictator, Titus Latius, persuaded them to send out an envoy to negotiate, and this time to listen to their needs. Dionysius of Halicarnassus records an impassioned speech from Titus Latius in favour of the people, and to their credit this time, the patricians actually listened. So they sent the former consul, Agrippa Menenius Lenatus, and perhaps a few other envoys to parley, as he was the most eloquent and popular of the patricians. The dependents of Rome out in the countryside were now desperate, as they lived directly in the path of war from the impending Latin invasion. Agrippa proved himself worthy of the later great man who bore his name. He convinced the people to sign a treaty with the Senate, and so was born the plebeian council and the tribunes of the plebs. At the inception of this role, there were 5 tribunes, one of whom was Sicinius, all granted exclusive plebeian political power and protected from violence at pain of death. It was a great victory for the people, who quickly rallied and joined the patricians to defeat the Latins. The resentment between the two classes felt a bubbling beneath the surface of society, for now. "20 years later, a tribune was found murdered in his home. This led to all of the tensions and resentment bursting out again. The patricians openly mocked the position, and many assumed responsibility for the crime, even when they had nothing to do with it, determined to diminish any power the tribune of the plebs might hold. The tribunes wavered under this assault, and when the former centurion Publius Volero refused to enlist as a legionary in the army, they did nothing to stop his public beating by the lictors. But the people heard his defiant cries, saw him powerfully fight off the oppressing lictors, and in the next round of elections they voted him in as tribune, and he proposed that tribunes should be elected at the Comitia Tributa, the tribal assembly. This would stop patricians being able to influence plebeian elections. The patricians responded by re-electing as consul Appius Claudius Crassus in Regilensis Sabinus, the same consul who time and time again wanted to crush any semblance of plebeian power. This in turn spurred another tribune, Gaius Łatorius, to deliver a speech against Appius Claudius. In retaliation, the savage consul tried to have him arrested, but the people began to riot once more. The other consul, Titus Barbatus, saved the day by interceding and having the Lex Publica, as it is now known, proposed by Volero passed, further strengthening the plebeians. In the decades which followed, the plebeians more actively pursued political equality with the patrician overlords, spurred by their incremental successes. Their next target came in 462 BCE, against the consuls themselves. At this time, consuls could only be patricians, which meant the plebeians were at the mercy of their leniency or their cruelty. After nearly 10 years of the patricians stalling plebeian efforts to create a plebeian task force to redefine the laws, an opportunity in 455 BCE arose to get an agreeable proposition over the finishing line. A large Aequi army had invaded their Tusculan allies, and Rome rushed to aid them. But the victorious consuls, instead of distributing the spoils of war amongst the army, filled the Republic's treasury. The tribunes of the plebs sprung to action and sued the consuls with their tribunician power to the tune of 10,000 livestock each, and one of the consuls 15,000. They then repeated their ask, a 5-man committee, exclusively of plebeians, to redefine Roman law and curtail consular power. The patrician consuls were outraged, but insisted that the concept of plebeians exclusively writing these laws was outrageous. So the tribunes backed off a little, understanding the need for delicate diplomacy, and simply suggested that a body of lawmakers, half pleb, half patrician, equipped with the right knowledge and right support, would benefit both sides. The patricians agreed to the concept, but not yet the details. So 3 men were sent in 454 BCE to Greek city-states around the Mediterranean and the Aegean to collect information on their instituta, mores, iuraque, their designs, customs, and laws. These envoys returned in 452 BCE, and the tribunes again pushed the issue. Now let it be said that the patricians, achthomenoetoi pragmati, being vexed by the proposals, tried again to stall it, ignoring the tribunes' dia klepsai dia nounto, intending to avoid their duty. What were the tribunes to do? They were so close, and what's more, one of the newly elected consuls about to enter office was their old enemy, none other than Appius Claudius, yet again. But the tribunes executed a diplomatic masterclass and appealed to Appius Claudius's weak spot, the same weak spots that all egotistical megalomaniacs suffer from, their desire for more power. So they did appeal to him and convinced him that if he established this committee, he would play an integral part in rewriting Rome's very constitution with a power greater than both tribune and consul combined, even if it was with other men. So lo and behold, he agreed. And not only that, so desirous of this unprecedented power that he delivered a speech so convincing in defense of Rome and all of its people that he even gained plebeian support despite his oppressive past. And so the decemvirate was born, comprised of the decemviri, 10 men. The plebeians even agreed to have it made up of entirely patricians, since the power would be tied to the need for all decemviri to run all legal proposals past any Roman citizen, patrician or pleb, so all would have the power and chance to vet them. In 451 BCE, the consuls, including Appius Claudius and the tribune of the plebs, all resigned. Appius Claudius and 9 other patricians then became the decemvirs and got to work using the Greek works collected to reframing the Roman legal system. In the year that followed, it was as if Appius Claudius was a new man. He was the de facto leader of the decemvirate, and the whole committee put real effort into drafting these new laws, working closely with the people. 10 bronze tables were the result, approved by the Comitia Centuriata, and had laid the bedrock for Roman law for centuries. The plebeians were very happy, and since each decemvir could veto the others, it was as if their plea for consular power to be limited had been answered. So when it was suggested that 2 more tables be added to round out the new Roman law in full, a majority was in favour of establishing a second decemvirate in 450 BCE. That was when things again began to fall apart. Appius Claudius kept up his nice guy facade, and as a result the plebeians insisted he be re-elected as the chief of the new decemvirate. But he was drunk on power, and the facade soon slipped. He was said to have engineered his own friends into the other 9 positions rather than the best candidates, and on their election they went behind closed doors and swore to each other that rather than veto each other, anything one suggested would be accepted by all. They planned to keep this 10-man oligarchy for life. No more kings, no more consuls, just decemvirs. And they went out into the streets, each man with a bodyguard of armed lictors, without any modesty and with the look of tyrants. The plebeians were in despair as the patricians already began to cozy up to these new despotic leaders, while Appius Claudius at their head renewed his oppression of the poor. He stripped their assets, their land, ordered arrests and executions, and fear ruled the land. As Cicero said, libidino se omni imperio et acerbe et avare populo praefuerunt. They conducted all civil affairs with debauchery and ruled both cruelly and oppressively towards the people. And just so you know, they did create those last 2 tables, and one of them prohibited marriage between plebeians and patricians, driving the wedge between them in further. Now, to cut a long story short, the decemvirate ended up without even senatorial support, as the senators boycotted it in the name of liberty. So when the Aequi invaded again, 2 decemvirs managed to muster up some soldiers who enlisted only because they realised if they didn't, they would be punished severely. The armies were routed by the Aequi and returned broken to Rome. Meanwhile, the tyrant Appius Claudius was making sexual advances to a plebeian woman, Virginia, a well-documented story and an often depicted source of art. There's some debate as to the truth of this story, but it's a powerful and tragic one nonetheless. Appius would not relent until he'd had his way with her, despite her father Verginius being a centurion and her having a fiancé, the former tribune Lucius Aecilius. So when she refused, he actually had one of his men claim her as a slave. A free citizen, now a slave, based purely on Appius Claudius's own lust and authority. No legal precedent from the previous constitutions would have allowed this. It was taken to court, where Appius Claudius presided as the judge himself, a rank miscarriage of justice. Aecilius and the crowds took to the streets to object at this legal hearing, and Verginius returned from his military camp to take action himself. The crowds in Rome around the court grew, chaos once more breaking out, as both Verginius and Aecilius were beloved by the people. The centurion and tribune rallied them further with their impassioned and defiant words. Appius would not relent. In the turmoil, as Verginius led his daughter towards the shrine of Cloacina, something shocking happened. Verginius took up a butcher's knife and cried out, "Modo filia in libertatem vindico!" "Only by this, my daughter, can I assure your freedom," and stabbed her in the heart. He turned to Appius Claudius and thundered out again, "Te Appii tuumque caput sanguine hoc consecro!" "It is you, Appius, you and your life I doom with this blood." A father had killed his daughter, but the crowds protected him. He left the city with 400 men as Appius Claudius now fled into exile. Support for Verginius grew and more soldiers joined him on the Aventine Hill. This led to the second secessio plebis, and as other plebeians joined them, they elected their own tribunes and moved to the site of the first secession, Mons Sacer. Their demand was simple: remove the decemvirate and return their plebeian right to appeal. Even the consuls had been better than this. Thanks to the intercession of two patricians, Lucius Valerius and Marcus Horatius, who became consuls with the resignation of the remaining decemviri, an agreement was made. The leges Valerii Horatii covered many of the plebeians' demands, including the re-establishment of the plebeian council and the right even to appeal consular elections. The other patricians weren't happy, but accepted it. Similar events of this kind occurred over the next few decades, including another secession, marking incremental improvements over a back and forth to the plebeian political power. But you'll notice in the above stories that nothing was ever really done about the economic condition of the people. Perhaps they'd hoped that with political power they'd manage to pass legislation favourable to their earnings, or relieving them of the burden of debt. But though they enjoyed more privileges than before, by the 4th century BCE they were still poor and oppressed, and while this would be the case essentially for the duration of Rome, I'll end this video with one more development that goes some way to responding to the very issue that started it all in the first place, the debt crisis. In 375 BCE, the plebeian tribunes once more considered their economic plight. They'd gained so much through their perseverance that it was time they pushed even harder to place themselves in summo imperio locates, not just tribunician power, but consular. They had the right of appeal once more, since the tribunes of the plebs could veto legislation if physically present, but being elected by the plebeian assembly, they were not officially magistrates. And though they could propose legislation, it was harder for them to have it passed. They objectively held less power than the patricians. Even the position of consular tribune, the tribunus militum consulare potestate, which emerged after the fall of the decemvirate to replace the old two consuls and was ostensibly open to the plebeians, was dominated by patricians. Fortunately for the plebs, the two tribunes they elected that year were two remarkable men, Gaius Licinius Stolo and Lucius Sextius. They were fearless and with unabashed confidence stood before the patrician senate and demanded three things. The first was that interest already paid on a debt should be reduced from the original sum, and that the remaining amount be paid off over the course of 3 years in equal installments. The second was that no Roman citizen should own land greater than 500 jugera, or acres. The final was that the consular tribunate should be abolished, and the annual election of 2 ordinary consuls be returned, this time with one of them being a plebeian. The patricians were shocked. The audacity of the plebeians to ask this of them was almost too much, and they were terrified that their lands, money, and prestige were under threat. But they were the ruling class, right? They didn't have to kowtow to their inferiors. The plebeians couldn't even pass laws, which is why, technically speaking, these were called the Licinio-Sextian rogations, not laws. They were asks, not legislation. Like bills today are passed into law, a rogation would be subject to vote before becoming law. So when Sextius and Licinius summoned the tribes to vote, the patricians began repeatedly using their own veto powers in what's called an intercession. The patricians turned up to the tribunal councils and vetoed any mention of their rogations. But the tribunes didn't back down. Sextius cried out, bene habet, quando quidem tantum intercessionem polere placet, isto ipso telotu dabimur plebem. Agite dum comitia indicite patres, tribunis militum creandis, faxone quid iu et voxista ueto, qua nunc concinentes collegas nostros tam laeti auditis. Very well then, if you so love the power of your intercessions, we will use that very same weapon for the plebeians. Come on then, patricians, summon your assembly, choose your military tribunes. I'll make sure you soon hate the word veto, which you now hear sung with such enthusiasm by our colleagues. For the next 5 years, the plebeians kept Sextius and Licinius as tribunes, and for 5 years they prevented the election of military or consular tribunes. Only a war with the Volsci made them relent and permit the appointments be resumed. But their fight continued in 368 BCE, when the patricians brought in a dictator to high power, Marcus Furius Camillus, no friend to the plebeians. He now had supreme power in Rome, but the plebeian tribunes' determination was kindled, not dampened. Their rogations were gaining more and more support. And finally, the Lex de Aere Alieno and the Lex de Modo Agrorum were passed. Economic empowerment and patrician curtailment took a step forward. But the patricians wouldn't budge on the plebeian consul issue. A new dictator came in now, Publius Manlius Capitolinus, and he actually names Licinius Stolo his magister equitum, second in command, and the first plebeian to hold the position. A step forward, but not the whole way, possibly even a distraction. And when Marcus Furius again became dictator, Rome clearly saw this issue as a major crisis. He and the Senate, finally, after a particularly severe struggle, gave in on the consul issue, and the Lex de Consuli Altero ex plebe was accepted. In 366 BCE, Lucius Sextius Sextinus Lateranus became the very first plebeian consul. And although the immediate aftermath from the patricians was so brutal that there was very nearly another secession, the plebs agreed to the creation of the praetorship, a patrician-only position beneath the consul, acting as chief legal officers. But this too would open up to plebeians a few decades later. So to finish up, I'd like to give a shout out to the plebeians of ancient Rome for proving that with sheer determination, changes can be made within, for the most part, legal frameworks. Their plight would continue for a long time, and the conflict of the orders wasn't officially over until 287 BCE. However, they came a long way from being little more than slaves, and some of Rome's greatest minds and leaders came from the plebeian class. And a big thank you to Alejandro Kaplan for giving me the idea for this fascinating and fun video.